Hello and welcome back to the Doctrine Deep Dive. I am your host.
And I am the resident international relations expert for the show.
And we are back with another stack of readings today that, quite honestly feels a bit like a survival guide for the 21st century.
It really does. It's a heavy stack today.
Right, because usually when we talk about international relations, especially for those of you listening who follow global conflict, we have this very cinematic view of things. You know, we picture the Situation Room in the White House. We picture satellite photos of missile silos or tanks rolling across borders. It is a very Cold War aesthetic.
Right, the kinetic stuff, the hardware, the things that go boom.
Exactly. But the stack of sources we are diving into today argues that the real battlefield isn't a piece of terrain at all.
No, it's not.
It is the wiring under the floorboards of the global economy. It is about how the things we thought were going to save us, things like trade, the internet, global banking, are actually being turned into weapons.
It's a complete inversion of that liberal optimism we saw in the 1990s.
The end of history era.
Exactly. Back then, the prevailing theory was that if we all traded with each other, we simply couldn't afford to fight.
Right.
But today's syllabus is arguing the exact opposite. Because we trade with each other, we actually have new and terrifying ways to coerce each other.
Which is why today's deep dive is entirely focused on economic statecraft. And specifically, we are focusing on the high-stakes wrestling match between the United States and China.
It is the defining relationship of our time.
And to really do this justice for you, the listener, we have to acknowledge the heavy hitters in our source list today. We aren't just skimming random internet blogs here. We are looking at some truly foundational academic texts.
We certainly are. We are anchoring this discussion with Joseph S. Nye Jr.'s article titled Power and Interdependence with China,
which was published in the Washington Quarterly.
Right. And if you study international relations at all, Joseph Nye is basically the godfather of the field. We can't talk about power dynamics without him.
We also have the paper that I think really changed the vocabulary of the discipline. It's called Weaponized Interdependence by Henry Farrell and Abraham L. Newman.
From the journal International Security.
Yes, that is where we get some of the really scary concepts we will unpack later.
Then we have Sifting Through Interdependence by Thomas Wright, which is also from the Washington Quarterly. That piece really helps us categorize how different nations are reacting to this mess.
And for the specific mechanics of Chinese influence, we have Audrey Wong's paper, Reaping What You Sow, Public Accountability, and the Effectiveness of China's Economic Statecraft.
And to round out the regional perspective, we brought in China and Competing Cooperation in Asia-Pacific by Yemin from the journal Asian Security.
Plus, we are bringing in some necessary reality checks from The Economist magazine on rare earth elements, specifically an article called Magnetic Attraction.
And finally, a Financial Times review of Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free.
So it is a very dense list, but before we get into it, I just want to explicitly state something for you, the listener.
Always a good idea.
Some of these texts touch on highly charged political strategies and trade policies from both the political left and the political right. Our mission today is purely analytical.
Right.
We are impartially reporting on the content provided by these authors to distill their essential insights. We are not endorsing any of the specific viewpoints or policies mentioned. We just want to convey the ideas so you can understand the theoretical landscape.
Absolutely. Our job is to break down the doctrine, not to pick sides in the trade war.
Perfect. So the narrative arc today is actually quite clear. We are going to go from the broad theory of how the world is wired to the specific strategies the United States and China are using to cut those wires.
And finally, to how the smaller nations caught in the middle are trying to survive the sparks.
Let's start with the theory, because I think we need to deprogram ourselves a little bit first.
How so?
Well, I grew up, and I think most of our listeners did too, with this Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention.
Yes. Thomas Friedman's theory.
Right. The idea was that no two countries that both had a McDonald's franchise had ever gone to war with each other.
Which was actually true for a brief period in the 90s.
Yeah, but the broader implication was that globalization was supposed to be this flat, decentralized web. Power was supposed to be completely diffused, and everyone had an equal stake in world peace because everyone was making money together.
That was the dream. It was a beautiful narrative. But Henry Farrell and Abraham L. Newman, in their piece on weaponized interdependence, they argued that this map of the world is just factually wrong.
It's a complete myth.
Exactly. Globalization did not create a flat spiderweb. It created a hub-and-spoke system.
Okay, unpack that distinction for us, because that seems to be the crucial pivot point for everything else we're going to talk about today.
Think about the internet. We always talk about the internet being decentralized. Anyone can spin up a website.
Right.
But physically, in terms of the actual infrastructure, it is not decentralized at all. A huge percentage of the world's internet traffic flows through a very small handful of fiber optic cables and massive server farms.
And a lot of those are located in the United States.
Exactly. Or look at global finance. If you want to move money from a local bank in Peru to a local bank in Thailand, you don't just send it directly across the Pacific.
The banks don't actually talk to each other directly.
No. The transaction almost inevitably passes through a major clearing bank located in New York City.
So instead of a fishing net where every single knot is equal in size and importance, it is more like the airline route map you see in the back of an in-flight magazine.
That is the perfect analogy.
You have these massive hubs like Atlanta or Frankfurt or Dubai, and everything else is just a tiny spoke connecting back to the hub.
Precisely. And Farrell and Newman argue that this physical structure creates what they call asymmetric networks.
Asymmetric, meaning unbalanced.
Right. If you are a country that happens to control one of those central hubs, you aren't just a regular participant in the network. You are the landlord of the network.
You own the road.
You own the roads, the toll booths, and the traffic cameras. You have structural power that literally no one else on the planet has.
And the authors identify two specific mechanisms for how a state actually uses that structural power. The first one they call the panopticon effect.
Yes.
Now, for anyone listening who maybe skipped Philosophy 101 in college, the panopticon was a prison design created by Jeremy Bentham.
Right, the circular prison.
Exactly. It's a design where a single guard sitting in a central tower could theoretically watch all the inmates in their cells without the inmates ever knowing exactly when they were being watched.
And in the context of economic statecraft, the panopticon is all about surveillance.
How does that work in practice?
Because the United States controls the central nodes of the global financial system. Specifically things like the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication Messaging System based in Belgium. And the dollar clearing system in New York, the United States, can effectively see transactions happening all over the world.
So it's not just about managing the money, it's about seeing the data attached to the money.
Yes. And the authors bring up the post-9/11 era as the prime example. The United States government used this exact capacity to track terrorist financing networks.
Right. They didn't need to put human spies on the ground in every single country in the Middle East.
No, they just needed to tap the wire at the central hub.
It is an incredible intelligence advantage when you think about it. You can map your adversary's entire network, who is paying who, just by watching the data flow through your own servers.
It's massive. But the second mechanism Farrell and Newman discuss is even more aggressive than surveillance.
The chokepoint effect.
Yes, this is the stick in economic statecraft.
The panopticon is watching, the chokepoint is acting.
Exactly. The chokepoint effect is the ability to completely deny a target access to the network. If you control the hub, you can simply turn off a country's ability to participate in the global economy.
And the classic example they use here is the sanctions campaign against Iran.
Right. The United States did not have to physically blockade Iranian ports with Navy destroyers to stop their trade.
Which would be an act of war.
Exactly. Instead, they effectively told the entire global banking system, if you touch Iranian money, if you process a single transaction for them, you lose your access to the United States dollar.
And because the United States dollar is the ultimate hub of global finance, no major bank in Europe or Asia could afford to say no.
They all complied. Iran was functionally frozen out of the global economy without a single shot being fired.
That is weaponized interdependence in its purest form. You are taking the very infrastructure that was supposed to bring the world closer together, the banking system, and you are using it to literally strangle an opponent.
It's brilliant, but it's also terrifying for anyone who isn't the United States.
But here is where Joseph Nye comes in with a really important nuance in his article, Power and Interdependence with China. He says we have to be careful not to overstate this dynamic.
Right.
Just because two countries are connected doesn't mean they are vulnerable in the exact same way.
Nye draws a very specific distinction between sensitivity and vulnerability.
Break that down for us.
So sensitivity means if the economy in China slows down, the United States stock market takes a dip.
We feel the pain. We are sensitive to it.
Yes. But vulnerability is different. Vulnerability means if China cuts us off entirely, our society collapses.
Okay.
Nye argues that real power only comes from asymmetry. If I depend on you more than you depend on me, you hold the leverage. If we both rely on each other equally, it's a standoff.
So let's apply that asymmetry to the actual United States and China relationship, because we hear a lot of doom and gloom in the media about how China owns so much of our national debt or how they manufacture all of our basic antibiotics. It paints a picture where the United States is entirely at their mercy. But Joseph Nye seems to think the balance of power is actually still tilted toward Washington.
He does. He firmly believes that. He
Yeah.
points out that while the sheer trade numbers between the two countries are absolutely massive, the structural advantages still belong to the United States.
Like what? What are those high cards?
Well, take energy, for example. The United States has largely achieved energy independence. China, on the other hand, still has to import a massive percentage of its oil.
And that oil comes through sea lanes.
Sea lanes that are currently dominated by the United States Navy, that is a massive asymmetry.
Right.
Furthermore, the United States still controls the global reserve currency. And the United States has a network of formal military alliances with roughly 60 different countries around the globe.
Whereas China has formal alliances with who? North Korea.
Exactly. It is a quality over quantity argument when it comes to power. The United States holds the structural hubs.
But just because the United States holds those high cards, it doesn't mean Washington is comfortable with the current trajectory. In fact, if we look at the Financial Times review of Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, we see a massive psychological shift happening in American policy.
It really is a complete rewrite of the economic playbook that governed the last 40 years.
And just to give some background, Robert Lighthizer served as the United States Trade Representative. He was a key architect of trade policy.
Yes. And his core philosophy, which has actually been largely maintained by subsequent administrations, argues that the last several decades of efficiency-first trade policies were a massive strategic mistake.
Efficiency first, meaning just find the absolute cheapest place on earth to build a product and build it there.
Exactly. And Lighthizer is essentially saying, who cares if a consumer t-shirt is $5 cheaper at the mall if we completely lost the domestic factory that makes the specialized steel required for our military tanks?
It's prioritizing national security and resilience over consumer pricing.
Right. The review notes that this is a return to a more Hamiltonian view of the economy.
Alexander Hamilton.
Yes. Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, these early American leaders were actually fierce protectionists. They deeply believed that you needed a strong, self-sufficient domestic industrial base to be a secure nation.
So radical free trade is actually the historical anomaly.
According to Lighthizer, yes. He argues that by bringing China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, without strictly demanding that they change their state-run, heavily subsidized economic model.
The United States effectively funded the rise of its own greatest rival.
Exactly. The gamble in the 1990s was that integrating China into global trade would automatically make them more democratic, that the internet and free markets would make them, quote-unquote, more like us.
And Lighthizer assessment is that the United States lost that gamble entirely. China did not become a liberal democracy. They became a highly capable, high-tech authoritarian state that happens to run a massive trade surplus with the rest of the world.
So now we are seeing the official United States doctrine shift away from unadulterated free trade toward what we might call managed trade or securitized trade.
Trade that defends national interests first.
Yes.
Before we move on to what China is actually doing with their side of the toolkit, I want to touch on one more conceptual framework from Joseph Nye that I just found completely fascinating.
The Kindleberger trap.
Yes, because we always hear pundits talk about the Thucydides trap.
Right. The ancient Greek historian.
Right. The idea that a rising power, like Athens or today China, will inevitably end up in a kinetic war with the established ruling power, like Sparta or the United States.
It frames conflict as almost a law of physics.
But Nye brings up this alternative model, the Kindleberger trap. Can you define that for the listeners?
I love this concept because it is so counterintuitive to how we normally think about threats. Charles Kindleberger was a brilliant economic historian who spent his career studying the Great Depression.
Oh, okay.
And he asked a fundamental question. Why was the 1930s such an unmitigated global disaster?
Right.
And his answer was not that there was too much aggression in the system initially. His answer was that there was too little global leadership.
Walk us through the historical context there.
So in the 1920s and 30s, Great Britain was the old, established global hegemon. But they were completely broke and exhausted after fighting World War I. They could no longer afford to run the global system.
They couldn't be the world's policeman or the world's bank.
Right. Now, the United States was the rising power. They had the capital, they had the massive industrial base. But American politics at the time was fiercely isolationist. The United States was entirely too selfish to take over the job of running the global order.
So Great Britain was too weak, and the United States simply refused to step up.
Exactly. So nobody was minding the store. And because of that leadership vacuum, the global financial system completely collapsed. There was no lender of last resort. There was no one willing to keep their markets open to absorb global goods.
Wow.
And that economic collapse paved the way for the fascism and the kinetic wars that followed.
So, applying that exact historical framework to today, the Kindleberger trap isn't a scenario where China actively attacks the United States Navy in the Pacific.
No.
The trap is a scenario where China becomes economically powerful enough to disrupt the existing system, but fundamentally refuses to take on the responsibility of fixing it or maintaining it.
That is exactly it. It is the free rider problem scaled up to the level of global geopolitics.
Right. Because the United States currently provides what economists call global public goods.
Yes. Things like using the Navy to keep international sea lanes open for everyone's trade, or leading global climate agreements, or acting as the ultimate backstop for global financial stability during a crisis.
And the fear Nye is articulating is that China desperately wants the prestige and the deference of being a recognized superpower, but they absolutely do not want to pay the massive bill for providing those global public goods.
They want the VIP access without paying the cover charge.
Yeah.
So imagine a future global crisis. Maybe another massive pandemic or a sudden catastrophic collapse in the financial markets.
Okay.
The United States might be too politically divided or economically weakened to fix the problem alone. And China, instead of cooperating, just shrugs and acts purely in its own narrow self-interest.
And the whole system just fractures.
Right. The system falls apart. It's not a war of aggression. It is basically the negligent homicide of the global order.
That is a genuinely terrifying thought, because it frames the ultimate danger not as China's military strength, but as China's lack of maturity as a responsible stakeholder in the system.
Exactly.
Let's pivot now to the Chinese side of the equation. We've talked about how the United States holds the financial choke points, but China has spent decades quietly building physical choke points of their own.
Very effectively, too.
And nothing illustrates this physical leverage better than the story of rare earth elements. We read a piece called Magnetic Attraction from The Economist magazine, and I have to say, the way it starts by describing the physical landscape in Gansu, China, is just completely dystopian.
It is a very visceral description of what it actually takes to power the modern world.
Yeah.
You have these lush, beautiful subtropical hills in southern China, and carved directly into them are these deeply scarred, massive brown pits filled with highly toxic chemical runoff water.
Because extracting these minerals is incredibly dirty work.
Yes, this is the hidden price of all our green technology. We all want the sleek new smartphones. We want affordable electric vehicles. We want massive offshore wind turbines to fight climate change.
And all of those technologies require specialized high-performance magnets.
Magnets that are made from rare earth elements like neodymium and dysprosium.
And for roughly 30 years, the Western world was perfectly happy to just let China dig that stuff out of the ground.
Right, because we didn't want the environmental devastation in our own backyards.
It was a classic case of the developed world outsourcing the negative externalities of manufacturing.
Exactly. China willingly accepted the severe ecological damage in exchange for achieving absolute market dominance. And it worked. At one point, China controlled something like 97% of the total global supply of refined rare earth elements.
97%. That is a staggering monopoly.
It is. The former Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, famously remarked way back in 1992, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths."
He knew exactly what he was doing long before the rest of the world realized how important these minerals would become.
He was patiently building a strategic choke point.
And then, in the year 2010, Beijing actually decided to test fire that weapon.
Yes. This is a crucial case study for anyone trying to understand the reality of economic statecraft.
Right.
There was a maritime incident. A Chinese fishing trawler collided with two Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the Senkaku Islands.
Which China also claims, and they call them the Diaoyu Islands.
Right, highly contested waters. And following the collision, the Japanese authorities arrested the captain of the Chinese fishing vessel.
Which obviously triggered a massive diplomatic standoff.
It did. But Beijing didn't just rely on angry press conferences. They used their economic leverage.
The rare earths.
Yes. Suddenly, all these major Japanese technology companies noticed that their shipments of critical rare earth elements from China just completely stopped arriving.
But the article notes that China never formally announced a sanction, right?
No, they didn't pass a formal law or declare an embargo. The Chinese customs officials just suddenly started finding, quote-unquote, paperwork issues with all the shipments heading to Japan.
Oh, wow. So it was an informal, plausible deniability kind of embargo.
Exactly. But it sent an absolute shockwave of panic through both Tokyo and Washington. It was this sudden, terrifying realization, oh no, Beijing can literally just turn off our high-tech manufacturing base whenever they want.
But this is where the academic theory of interdependence we discussed earlier gets really interesting, because both Joseph Nye and Thomas Wright point out in their articles that while this embargo definitely hurt Japan's economy in the short term, it was actually a massive strategic failure for China in the long term.
It completely backfired.
Why is that? Why did having that much leverage fail?
Because global markets are dynamic, and they adapt. Interdependence allows for what Thomas Wright calls self-correction.
Okay.
By actually pulling the trigger and using the economic weapon, China proved to the entire world that they were an inherently unreliable supplier.
They showed their hand.
Yes. And that sudden spike in prices, combined with the sheer strategic terror of being cut off, instantly drove massive amounts of capital into finding alternative sources.
And the Economist article details exactly what that response looked like. The Japanese government stepped in and funded a massive multi-million-dollar loan to an Australian mining company called Lynas.
Right.
And they used that money to build a massive new rare earth processing refinery in Malaysia, just completely bypassing China.
And the reaction in the United States was similar. Investors dusted off the old Mountain Pass rare earth mine in California, which had been closed down for years due to environmental regulations and cheap Chinese competition.
They reopened it specifically to break the monopoly.
Exactly. Now, it took a few years to get these operations running, but as a direct result of that 2010 embargo, China's total market share of rare earth production dropped from over 90% down to closer to 70%.
So they essentially broke their own absolute monopoly because they overplayed their hand over a fishing boat incident.
It is the ultimate paradox of the choke point.
Right.
The very moment you actually squeeze the choke point, your victim immediately starts looking for a way to breathe somewhere else.
But, and this is a big but, the story definitely does not end there, because the Economist piece makes a very important point about what China's new updated strategy is today.
Right.
They aren't just trying to corner the market on digging the dirt out of the ground anymore. They are deliberately moving downstream.
And this is the truly smart play by Beijing. Mining the raw rock is the dirty, heavily polluting, low profit margin part of the business. The real economic value and the real strategic choke point is in the processing phase. It is the ability to take that raw, dirty rock and chemically refine it into a highly specialized, high-performance magnet that can withstand the intense heat inside a cruise missile engine or an electric vehicle motor.
That requires serious intellectual property.
It requires incredibly complex metallurgy, highly specialized factories, and decades of engineering experience.
And China is absolutely dominating that specific processing step right now.
Completely. To the point where even if the United States physically digs the raw rare earth rock out of the ground in California at the Mountain Pass mine, they currently have to load a lot of that raw material onto ships and send it to China just to be processed into usable metals.
Wow. So China's goal is to make sure that even if the Western world successfully diversifies the dirty mining part, we are all still trapped inside the Chinese supply chain when it comes to getting the finished, usable product.
Exactly. So the choke point hasn't actually disappeared. It has just migrated further up the technological value chain.
Which is much harder to replicate.
Much harder. Breaking that specific dependency requires rebuilding an entire industrial ecosystem of processing facilities that the Western world willingly let die out decades ago.
It's not just about opening a mine, it's about reinventing an entire manufacturing sector.
Exactly.
Well, let's move from the sticks of economic statecraft to the carrots. Because China isn't just threatening countries with embargoes, they're also aggressively seducing them with massive amounts of cash and infrastructure.
And this is where Audrey Wan's research is so vital.
Yes, her paper, Reaping What You Sow. She argues that what China's doing isn't just normal, traditional foreign aid. She introduces this fantastic term, subversive carrots.
I genuinely think this is one of the most useful analytical concepts in our entire stack of readings today.
Okay, define a subversive carrot for us. How is it different from a regular carrot?
So a normal, traditional economic carrot would be something like a mutually beneficial free trade agreement or a highly transparent development grant from the World Bank to build a water treatment plant.
Where all the accounting is public?
Right. Subversive carrots, on the other hand, are economic inducements that are deliberately structured to bypass the established political checks and balances of the target country.
We are talking about massive infrastructure loans that never actually get debated in the local parliament.
Exactly. Multi-billion-dollar contracts that are signed in secret between heads of state. Money that somehow ends up enriching the ruling family's private businesses rather than going into the national treasury.
It sounds a lot like weaponized corruption.
That is effectively what it is. But Audrey Wong's core thesis isn't just pointing out that China does this. Her real insight is that the effectiveness of these subversive carrots depends almost entirely on the internal political system of the country receiving the money.
The target matters just as much as the weapon.
Exactly. And she introduces this crucial variable that she calls public accountability.
To illustrate this, she contrasts three very different countries in Southeast Asia: Cambodia, the Philippines, and Myanmar. Let's look at Cambodia first, because according to the research, this is the ultimate success story for China's strategy.
It is a massive strategic success for Beijing, though perhaps not a success for the average Cambodian citizen.
Why is that?
Cambodia is ruled by Hun Sen, who has essentially been in continuous power for over 30 years. It is a deeply authoritarian system.
So, extremely low public accountability.
Exactly. There is no independent press. The opposition parties are routinely dismantled. So when Beijing comes to Phnom Penh and offers a massive opaque loan to build a new bridge or a sprawling sports stadium, Hun Sen can simply accept the money.
He doesn't have to answer to anyone.
Right. He can take the loan, funnel the lucrative construction contracts directly to his political cronies, and absolutely no one in the country has the power to investigate or stop him.
And in exchange for making him and his allies very wealthy, Cambodia essentially functions as China's proxy in the region.
They act as China's loyal pit bull. You see this play out constantly within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN operates on a strict consensus model. So every time the other Southeast Asian nations try to release a joint diplomatic statement condemning China's aggressive island-building campaign in the South China Sea, Cambodia simply vetoes the statement.
They block the consensus.
Every single time. China has effectively purchased a permanent veto over all regional diplomacy simply by feeding subversive carrots to an authoritarian leader.
But then Wong points us to the Philippines as a counterexample. And this is where the strategy yields a very different outcome.
Yes.
She focuses on a specific event during the administration of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, the National Broadband Network deal.
Often referred to as the NBN ZTE, ZTE being the Zhongxing Telecommunication Equipment Corporation, a massive Chinese telecom company.
Right, so what happened there?
This was roughly a $330 million deal for ZTE to build a nationwide broadband network for the Philippine government. And it had all the classic hallmarks of a subversive carrot. It was wildly overpriced compared to competitors. The negotiations were highly opaque. And it was heavily alleged that the president's husband was personally brokering the kickbacks.
Now, if this had happened in Cambodia, it would have just been rubber stamped and built.
Exactly. But the Philippines, despite its flaws, has a very different political culture. They have a loud, chaotic, and fiercely independent press.
High public accountability.
High accountability. They also have a Senate that absolutely loves to hold dramatic, televised investigative hearings.
So the secret deal didn't stay secret.
No. Investigative journalists started digging into the contract. Brave whistleblowers from within the government actually came forward to testify. The Philippine Senate dragged the involved cabinet officials in for highly publicized cross-examinations.
Wow.
And the resulting public outrage among the Filipino citizens was so intense and so widespread that President Arroyo was politically forced to completely cancel the ZTE deal just to save her own presidency from collapsing.
So in a system with high public accountability, the subversive carrot didn't just fail to work. It actually became a massive political liability.
It backfired spectacularly. It did not buy Beijing any long-term influence. Instead, it generated a massive wave of anti-China sentiment across the entire Philippine electorate.
It proved that these opaque deals are inherently fragile when exposed to the light.
Yes. Subversive carrots flourish in the dark, authoritarian corners of the world, but they absolutely wither and die in the sunlight of a democratic press.
And the third case study she provides, Myanmar, perfectly illustrates what happens when a country actually transitions from one system to the other while the deal is happening.
Myanmar is a fascinating laboratory for this theory.
Because initially, Myanmar was ruled by a brutal military junta.
Right, so it functioned exactly like Cambodia, extremely low accountability. And during that time, China easily negotiated a massive, opaque deal to build a Myeongseon Dam on the Irrawaddy River.
A huge infrastructure project.
Massive. It was going to flood an area the size of Singapore, displace thousands of local villagers, and export 90% of the generated electricity straight back to China.
Wow. And the junta generals just took the payoff and approved it.
Exactly. But then, around 2011, Myanmar began a surprising, albeit temporary, transition toward a semi-civilian, more democratic government.
They started opening up.
Yes. Suddenly, there was a degree of press freedom. Civil society groups were allowed to organize protests.
The public accountability variable flipped.
It flipped completely. And the citizens absolutely hated the Myeongseon Dam project. It became a symbol of Chinese exploitation and military corruption. And because the new civilian government actually had to care about public opinion to maintain their legitimacy, they were forced to suspend the entire multi-billion-dollar project.
Which must have infuriated Beijing.
Oh, they were livid. But it perfectly proves Audrey Wong's point. You can rent a dictator, but you cannot easily rent a mobilized democratic public.
And I think that serves as a really profound warning, not just for Chinese policymakers trying to buy influence, but also for United States policymakers trying to counter that influence.
How so?
Well, if Washington wants to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative in the developing world, they don't necessarily have to match China dollar for dollar in infrastructure loans.
Right.
The most cost-effective defense might simply be funding independent journalism, anti-corruption nonprofits, and strong democratic institutions in those countries.
Absolutely. Promoting public accountability is quite literally the best possible defense against subversive economic statecraft.
This brings us to the final piece of the strategic puzzle today. We have spent a lot of time analyzing the giants, the United States and China. But what about everyone else in the region?
The countries living in the splash zone.
Right. Countries like Vietnam, Singapore, South Korea, Indonesia. How are they navigating this clash of titans?
Both Thomas Wright and Ye Min, in their respective articles, use a very specific term to describe the overarching strategy of these middle powers. They call it hedging.
Hedging their bets.
Yes. It is an incredibly delicate geopolitical balancing act. Because if you look at the trade data, almost every single nation in the Asia-Pacific relies primarily on China for their economic prosperity. China is their largest trading partner, their biggest export market, and a crucial source of investment.
But they don't necessarily trust China's long-term political ambitions.
Not at all. There is deep historical mistrust. So while they rely on Beijing for their economy, they actively rely on Washington for their national security.
They want the wealth from the Chinese market, but they want the United States Navy aircraft carriers permanently stationed over the horizon just in case Beijing gets too aggressive.
Exactly. They're trying to maintain what scholars call a dual order, an economic order centered on China, overlapping with a security order guaranteed by the United States.
And the absolute nightmare scenario for any leader in Singapore or Jakarta is being forced by either side to definitively choose one over the other.
They will do everything in their power to avoid making that choice.
But remaining neutral is getting harder because the United States and China are actively building competing economic architectures.
The battle of the trade frameworks.
Right. Ye Min's article goes into great detail about this. He calls it a battle of acronyms. But since we are avoiding acronyms today, let's spell these out clearly.
Good idea.
First, we had the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right. This was originally the grand United States strategy under the Obama administration. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was explicitly designed to be a high-standard, heavily regulated free trade agreement among 12 Pacific Rim nations.
But noticeably excluding China.
Exactly. It included very strict rules regarding independent labor unions, rigorous environmental protections, and robust intellectual property rights.
Things that the Chinese state-run economic model fundamentally cannot comply with.
Right. And Ye Min notes in his research that Chinese political elites viewed the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a direct threat. They essentially saw it as an economic version of NATO.
An alliance designed to contain them.
Yes. A deliberate attempt by Washington to rewrite the rules of global trade, specifically to exclude China and stunt its continued rise.
But then domestic politics in the United States shifted drastically, and the Trump administration officially pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership before it was fully ratified.
Which I imagine led to some very quiet, very intense celebrations in the halls of Beijing.
Because it cleared the way for China's preferred alternative framework.
Yes, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Which is technically led by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but China is the undisputed economic center of gravity within it.
Right, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is a fundamentally different beast than the American-led deal. It is incredibly shallow by comparison.
Meaning it doesn't have all those strict rules.
Exactly. It doesn't ask any difficult questions about labor rights or government subsidies to state-owned enterprises.
Yeah.
It is almost entirely focused on just lowering basic tariffs and streamlining customs procedures across Asia.
So China loves it because it deeply integrates the regional supply chains tightly around the Chinese domestic market without imposing any structural reforms on how Beijing runs its own economy.
And crucially, the United States is not in the room.
But China isn't just relying on trade agreements. They have their own proactive, massive infrastructure strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is often referred to historically as the New Silk Road.
Yes, this is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy project.
And Yuman's article provides a really fascinating Chinese domestic perspective on why this project actually exists. He cites a metaphor from Chinese scholars called the two wings theory.
I thought this was incredibly insightful.
Break down the two wings for us.
So, for the first 30 or 40 years of China's economic miracle, the country essentially flew on just its east wing.
Meaning the eastern coastal cities.
Right. Places like Shanghai and Shenzhen. They developed rapidly by building factories and shipping millions of manufactured goods across the Pacific Ocean to markets in the United States and Japan.
But that created a massive destabilizing imbalance inside the country.
Exactly. The eastern seaboard became incredibly wealthy and modern, while the vast interior and western provinces of China remained deeply impoverished and underdeveloped.
So the Belt and Road Initiative is actually an attempt to build up the west wing of the eagle.
Yes. By building thousands of miles of high-speed rail lines, massive highways, and new energy pipelines stretching westward from central China all the way through Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually into Europe.
So the Chinese eagle can finally fly straight, higher and farther, using both wings.
It is a brilliant geopolitical narrative. But Yuman emphasizes that the true core driver is actually domestic economics.
The overcapacity problem.
Yes. We have to remember how the Chinese economy functions. For decades, they utilized massive state-owned enterprises to churn out truly astronomical quantities of industrial materials. Steel, cement, glass.
But you can only build so many empty apartment buildings and redundant airports inside your own borders before the domestic market is completely saturated.
Right. They have physically run out of profitable things to pave over inside China. But they absolutely cannot afford to just shut those massive steel factories down.
Because that would lead to millions of unemployed, angry young men in the streets, which is the ultimate nightmare for the Communist Party.
Exactly. So they desperately need to export all of that excess concrete and steel. They literally need to finance and build new highways in Kenya and massive deep water ports in Sri Lanka just to keep their own domestic industrial workforce employed and quiet back home.
That reframes the entire Belt and Road Initiative. It's not just a grand master plan for global domination. It is partly a desperate pressure release valve for their own internal economic distortions.
It really is. And Yuman adds a really critical nuance here that we rarely hear in Western media. We tend to view the Belt and Road as this unstoppable, monolithic juggernaut.
Right.
But he points out from his research that inside the halls of power in Beijing, there is actually a tremendous amount of fierce internal debate and skepticism about the strategy.
Skepticism from the Chinese elites themselves.
Yes. Many prominent Chinese economists and foreign policy scholars are deeply worried that Xi Jinping is committing the classic error of imperial overstretch.
Interesting.
They look at the trillions of dollars the United States essentially burned in the deserts of the Middle East over the last 2 decades, and they worry China is making the exact same historic mistake.
Why are we loaning billions of dollars to highly unstable, corrupt regimes in places like Pakistan or Venezuela that have absolutely no realistic ability to ever pay us back?
Exactly. They worry they are just throwing good money after bad. It circles right back to our earlier discussion about the Kindleberger trap.
Being a true global superpower is incredibly expensive.
It is. And there's a very real growing fear among some Chinese intellectuals that by expanding so rapidly, they're simply buying toxic liabilities rather than acquiring valuable strategic assets. They worry they are just inheriting all the intractable global problems that the weary Western world is currently trying to leave behind.
So if we take a step back and synthesize all of this, we have covered the theory of asymmetric networks, the return of American protectionism, the choke points of rare earth elements, the insidious nature of subversive carrots, and the delicate hedging strategies of the regional middle powers.
We have covered a lot of ground today.
If we look at the overarching doctrine here, what is the ultimate takeaway for our listeners? What era are we actually living in?
I think the most accurate description comes from Thomas Wright's framing. He says we have entered an extended period of cooperative rivalry.
Cooperative rivalry. It sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, but it captures the reality perfectly. The old optimistic idea of total frictionless engagement, the McDonald's theory of peace, is completely dead.
Right.
But the opposite extreme, the idea of a total decoupling, a brand new Cold War, where the two spheres completely sever all ties and never speak to each other, that is functionally impossible.
The global supply chains are just too deeply fused together to ever truly separate without causing a global depression.
Exactly. So we are trapped in this messy, volatile middle ground. We are forced to continue trading billions of dollars with our greatest strategic rival.
We are essentially shaking hands with our right hand while tightly gripping a dagger behind our back with our left hand.
That is exactly what economic statecraft is in the 21st century. And that specific dynamic leads directly to the final provocative thought I want to leave our listeners with today.
I love a good provocative thought to close out the deep dive. Let's hear it.
When we think about the danger of a future conflict between the United States and China, say, a crisis over the status of Taiwan, we usually imagine a deliberate, planned military invasion initiating the war.
Right. Amphibious assault ships, airstrikes.
But based on all the doctrine we've read today, the real danger in this new era isn't necessarily a planned, kinetic first strike. The true danger is accidental miscalculation, born directly from the sheer complexity of this weaponized economic machinery.
Walk us through how that miscalculation would actually happen in practice.
So imagine, tensions are extremely high in the Taiwan Strait. Beijing feels they need to send a very strong, undeniable message to Washington to back down.
Okay.
But they don't actually want to start World War III. They don't want to sink a United States aircraft carrier because they know that means immediate kinetic retaliation.
Right. They want to escalate without shooting.
Exactly. So they look at their toolkit of economic statecraft and they think, well, we will use a non-lethal economic weapon instead. We will suddenly dump a massive portion of our United States Treasury bond holdings onto the open market. Or we will completely cut off the supply of active pharmaceutical ingredients for critical antibiotics heading to American hospitals.
They view that as a limited, controllable escalation.
Yes, a very painful warning shot across the bow. But here's the fatal flaw in that logic. Because these global networks are so incredibly complex, because of the panopticon and chokepoint effects, we discuss the actual impact of pulling that economic lever might be far more catastrophic than Beijing ever intended.
It spirals out of control.
Completely out of control. Suddenly dumping the treasury bonds might cause a cascading panic that accidentally crashes China's own fragile banking sector in the process.
Because they are tied to the same system.
Exactly. Or cutting off the critical drug supply might cause such immense immediate panic and suffering inside the United States that the American president feels politically compelled to respond, not with sanctions, but with immediate military force.
So the economic weapon, which was supposed to be the safe alternative to war, actually becomes the hair trigger that accidentally starts the war.
Precisely. We are playing with a machine that we do not fully understand. We treat the global economy like it is a neat, orderly chessboard where you can carefully calculate every move.
But it's not a chessboard.
No, it is a highly volatile nuclear reactor. And if you blindly pull the wrong control rod just to make a political point, you might accidentally melt down the entire facility.
On that incredibly sobering but vital note, I think we will wrap it up there. Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredibly dense syllabus today.
It is always a pleasure to unpack the complexities of global doom with you.
And a huge thank you to all of you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey through the wiring of the world. This has been the Doctrine Deep Dive. Keep reading your sources, stay highly skeptical of the simple narrative, and we will see you next time.